Hey, hold up, man. I got something to say, man. Wait. What y'all out here for, man?
Welcome back, Watt Warriors. Roy with Air Pro Coaching, coming to you with a race review. So I wanted to put together a little race review showing an event that we did this past weekend. It's a Criterium. It's a little less than a mile course. And I want to show you how we break down their race and use that information to design workouts, and then also show athletes how they can improve their race performance and also their training. So races aren't just about getting on the podium. They can also show you how to improve your training, interval design, show you your strengths, your limiters, things like that. So we're going to go ahead and dive into this. This is an athlete I've been coaching for a long time. Got his permission to use this last weekend's file. And in the last 14 days, he won a race and then he took second. So this is going to be something that I think everyone can learn from. Okay, so this first file here is just to show you what we're looking at up here at the top. This yellow is his power. So he has a power meter, and it's measuring the efforts that he's putting in. You can see in the beginning of this ride, or race I should say, you can see lots of power spikes, lots of efforts being put in, and then about halfway through the ride you see it steady out. And this is where he makes the move. So you can see a definitive change of lots of explosive efforts to a steady state effort, and that's kind of the indicator that a break has been made, and this athlete made the selection. So if we dig a little deeper, I separated this into just before the break. So before the break, the athlete, I set up a chart to show using WKO 4.0. Tim Krushak, who is one of the leaders in this, kind of set up a chart pack, and what I did is I went in and I customized it just a little bit to give me some information about this specific athlete. So in the first 20 minutes, you can see they averaged about 287 watts. Their normalized power was 315, so the intensity factor was at 1.09. So it was aggressive, but not overly. Usually we'll see a variability index of 1.2 on super aggressive rides with lots of spikes, ups and downs of power. So, but you can see the volatility. You can see the efforts being put in. Their peak 1 minute power was 400 watts. Their peak 8 minute power was 312. Their peak 10 minute was 309. And their average cadence was 88. So I just use all this information to kind of gain some insight on how hard, what type of efforts were being put out in that first 20 minutes of the race. And then you can see here there's a little bit of a rest period. Then he snaps off a hard effort to make the winning move and put himself in the break. All right, but what happened before this break is important. So right here, what happened before this break, I use this chart called I levels, and it breaks down how much time is spent in the different zones. So we can see by a percentage and the amount of work. And this is why it's important. So if we look at this, about 39% of the time was spent at a level called FRC, FTP, and FRC. So functional reserve capacity and functional reserve capacity FTP. So this is above threshold efforts. And you can see 39% of that 20 minutes is spent at these higher level anaerobic zones. Now, if we take that percentage a little bit further, how much work was done? So this person did 115 kilojoules at just over threshold, and then at FRC, 79 kilojoules. And why is that important? Well, if you were going to set up a workout to mimic the demands of this event, or you want to see where you stand up, you would want to segment out a intensive 20 minutes, and then in that 20 minutes, how much time or how much percentage are you spending at these different levels, and how much work are you putting in, and does it stack up? Because if you're falling, like if you're setting up workouts that are only putting 20% of the time in, or you're only doing about 50 kilojoules of work, then you're really not meeting the demands of this event. And again, this event is a A-level local training ride that happened this weekend. So if you're unable for 20 minutes, okay, this is a 20-minute period, if you're unable to put in 40% of that time over a threshold, then you need to kind of adjust your training and work up to that. So that's why this is kind of important. It gives us a sense of what we need to come to the table with, or how do we adjust our training? Like, do we need to train, or excuse me, racing? Do we need to race a little wiser because we don't have the ability to ride at this type of intensity? This is a very fit athlete. So if we know that, hey, I can't ride at this level, then we may need to hide out and we may need to conserve a little bit more. Here you can see he's firing off all these big spikes are big matches being burned. So he's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 matches burned. We may not have that, right? So as an athlete with maybe not as much fitness or anaerobic capacity, then maybe we need to limit the amount of matches we fire off. So that's another thing it'll tell us. It'll show us that maybe we can't fire off as many matches as this athlete, or do we need to raise our training to that level? So a couple different ways to look at it and gain insight. The other thing I wanted to look at is how this person was producing their power. What kind of cadences were they doing? And if you can look at this, I'll see if I can blow this up a little bit here. They spent a majority of their time in quadrant 3. So low cadence, low force. And that's good. That's what you want to do. In this area here, they're low cadence, low force, meaning that they were hiding out and they were only putting force on that pedal when it was needed. So all of these high spikes or matches, probably before that or some periods before that, they were coasting, they were hiding out within the group, they were recovering, and then again, low cadence, low force. Here you see 23% of their time, high force, high cadence, low force. So they're spinning, but they're not putting a lot of force on the pedals. And that's really key in criterium racing. You don't want to be, you want to kind of save your legs spinning that and not putting a lot of force out. Now, when they were applying force, they were applying high cadence, high force. So that's good. Some of these short, intensive efforts you want to do at high cadence, high force. And then his least amount of time was spent at low cadence, high force. So if you see that guys in the group pushing that massive gear, getting in and out of the corners because they're in such a big gear, you're going to see that time higher. You're going to see that high force, low cadence number be higher. So this guy really managed his cadence well. Sure, there's always area of improvement, but it overall did a very good job at cadence production and power. Now, let's see what happened in the break. So when this person made the move, so all these efforts, boom, 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 he made this last-ditch effort, got in a breakaway with one other rider, so it was him and one other rider, and you can see the power just smooths out like a time trial almost. And when you're in a break with maybe 1 or 2 riders, upwards of 4 riders, you're going to see that smoothness looking like a team time trial or a time trial effort, and you'll see the variability index drops off, steady effort, his average power and normalized power almost are equal, so which is very consistent with like a time trial effort. Then you can look at their peak powers during the break. So during the break, let's go back a second. Here their peak power, their peak 8 minute was 3:12 when he was in the attack mode or before the break, and then after the break it went to 3:19, so a little bit higher 8 minute power. He's putting out another 8 minutes at 3:19, and then the 10-minute power is 3:13, where here the 10-minute power is 3:10. So you're seeing some differences on the steadier effort there. And then overall average power 300. So what do we take away from this? Well, 1, he's not coasting at all. 2, it's 23 minutes at 300 watts. So he's putting in an effort after he before the break, all these intensive efforts, average power about 290-ish, normalized 300, and then he makes a move, and he still has the legs to hold 300 watts for an additional 23 minutes. So that's important. I mean, if you're going to go with that move, right, if you're going to take that chance, go with that move, you got to have that fatigue resistance or the ability to hold that power to stay away from the field. And so if you go in a break, right, and you, let's say he went in that move and he followed that guy, but that guy wasn't able to kind of help him out. They weren't able to sustain that power. Maybe their power dropped off to like 260, 270, and then they're just sitting out there wasting energy, and eventually the group's going to catch them. If you end up going with the move and you just don't have that ability to hold 300 watts, eventually you could, if you don't ride wisely, get thrown from the break. So if you're like, hey, I don't have 300 watts, I do have 280 watts of threshold, then you need to take shorter pulls, maybe skip a few pulls, and coach them into letting you stay in the break, because you sit there and you sit on the break, they're gonna try to bump you off it, and this guy clearly could be stronger than you if your threshold's only 270. Again, threshold number is sustained effort of almost an hour. This guy did about 300 watts for an hour, so very stout effort, and he ended up winning this race. So he ended up making the move. He won the race, and then if we let's look at that eye level chart again, the chart that shows how much time was spent in the zones. Once he made the move, so once they made the break, 52% of the time was just over threshold. So again, just like a good time trialist, you're going to ride it right at the edge, right there at FRC FTP, and he did. Spent 52% of that time in the break. He spent 78% of the time was at threshold or above. And so he didn't spend much time in the recovery zones or zones under threshold. So again, just like a time trial, held a steady effort. And again, if you're not able to do that, then going in that move, you have to be conservative with your efforts, and you have to choose wisely when you're going to put your efforts in. Now, this guy is pretty strong, so he's able to really drive the move, drive the break. If we look at this athlete's, what they did, watch how their power production changes when they're in the break. So when they're in the break, 65% of the time was spent at low cadence, high force. So that might be something we might look at. He's really slamming the gear, pushing a bigger gear, trying to grind it out. I'm sure fatigue is building up because of all the efforts he did before the break went. So he's spending 65% of the time at low cadence, high force, so that's going to put a lot of strain on the muscles there. A little less, he's trying to probably bring his heart rate down after he put in all these explosive efforts. So 65% of that time at low cadence, high force. And if we compare that back to what it was before the break, let's see if I can find that chart before the break. Here it is. It was really most of his time was spent here, low cadence, low force, high cadence, low force. So not a lot of force being put out, 53% of the time, low force efforts. And the only time he was putting out some higher force cadence efforts, really was doing high cadence, high force. So again, how you produce that power is important, especially in criterium or circuit type racing. So I looked at that here, and I saw 65% of the time, he's slamming that big gear, and I looked at the overall. So this is the entire race here. You can see again before the break, after the break, and I ran a quadrant analysis on that, and you can see that I like to see something I learned from Tim from Training Peaks is that we want to see this to be an egg shape, and this egg shape is kind of being laid on its side. So the egg's kind of falling over on its side. So there may be some opportunity for this athlete to work on his cadence, meaning that they're pushing maybe a little bit too much low cadence, high force, and that we'd like to see this egg shape stand up a little bit versus being in this oval laying down on its side. So, all right, so we talked about a bunch of numbers, FRC, FTP, 39% of the time, at FRC, FTP. So what do I do with that? Well, we talked a little bit about maybe tactically, if you're not an athlete that has 300 watts for an hour, how do I work it with something like? Well, one, you're not going to be able to fire off all these matches. You may only have 3 matches, so you have to kind of time it, and you're going to see a trend here when I show you another race. So this is just one of the races, but within 20 minutes, the selection was made, the break happened, and this athlete got away. Now, if you don't have as many matches, then maybe you have to wait. You may have to hold off and fire off those matches at different times. So what you'll notice is that attacks in the beginning of the race may come back faster. So if you're in the race and you see a couple moves up the road, they'll come back pretty quick because a lot of people are fresh. You're going to have a lot more riders being able to respond and bring back those moves. Now, around minute 15, you start to see more attacks, and then about minute 20, there's a slowdown because of that series of attacks, and then that was the opportunity that this rider took to put in an effort, and it broke away. He made the selection. So if you don't have as many, you may want to wait for those late attacks, mid-race attacks, before you go with a selection of riders. Okay. Ideally, if you're not a high threshold rider, if you're a sprinter type rider, pursuiter, you're going to want to stay within the pack, and hopefully it comes to maybe a move at the end of the race, or it comes to the line and you out sprint everyone. In this race, it didn't, so it favored those who can ride in a break. All right. So also, what do I do? How do I build programs or a workout, or what do I do to maybe improve my training so I can ride at this level? Well, the first thing you can do is look at your zones, training zones. So we use iLevel. W4.0 has set up iLevels. And if you look at anything, let's say hard tempo or below or threshold, those are pretty standard. But FRC, FTP, PMAX, these are all new levels, which are very important for road racing. So if we go back again, sorry, I'm jumping back and forth, but if we go back here, 39%, 27% of that time, FRC, FTP, 115 kilojoules. All right, so if we go back in here, we look at FRC, FTP, their zone is 300 to 451 watts. So for 20 minutes, they can hold 300 watts. For a minute and 48 seconds, they can hold 451 watts. So somewhere in here, we want to build some repeatable intervals in the ranges of 20 minutes to a minute 48, probably closer to the shorter ranges right here in the minute 48 range. We don't want to, we want to probably, and again, every coach is going to err or decide on how to prescribe. But for a criterium or for that type of event, we probably want to err towards the shorter durations, higher intensities, and then we want to prescribe work that is about 27% of the work set, and then they want to do 115 kilojoules. So if I was going to specifically mimic the demands of this event, I would take 20 minutes, and in 20 minutes I'd have them do repeatable efforts that were at FRC, FTP ranges, and that they were getting close as possible to 115 kilojoules of work. And so at the end of that interval, let's say I had them do 2-minute intervals. So I go, hey, I want you to do 2-minute intervals. I want you to do 2-minute on, 3-minute off for 20 minutes. So that's what, 4 times 5 is 20 minutes. So you're going to do 8 minutes. So you're going to do 4 times 2, 3-minute recoveries. And then we're going to have them do that interval. And we're going to look at that interval. We're going to say, okay, you did 20% and you did 80 kilojoules. So you did some work, you got close, but you didn't do enough. So then maybe we tweak it a little bit and we say, hey, I want you to ride 2-minute intervals every 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off. But instead of being off, I want the recovery periods to be at like an endurance or a tempo rate, so that way it's not fully off. And then you're gassing it again right at 2 minutes, so you're going on and off. And so you build that type of effort, and you look back at that interval and you go, hey, you did 100 kilojoules of work and you did 25%. We're real close now. So that's how you can build intervals that are very specific to the demand of the event. And having a race file like this, as a coach, I can look at that event, which is very similar to most events of this nature, and then I can build training programs for this specific athlete. Every athlete's going to be different. For this person, that's what they need. For another person, they may need something else. But we can take these iLevels, which again are very individualized to the person, and we can build a training program or build an interval session that will mimic the demand of this event. Now, we're mimicking this area, right? So we say, hey, I want you to do 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, and then you're going to do it at FRC, FTP intensity. All right, so that's somewhere in this range, and we'll prescribe with specific training targets. And then after 20 minutes of 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, I want you to go and ride at an effort. Maybe that effort could be sweet spot, that effort could be threshold, whatever it is, and I want you to ride that for 20, 30 minutes. All right, so there you have something that's mimicking the demands of the event. 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, boom, 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 and then all of a sudden you are off for 20 minutes doing a hard tempo or threshold effort. Again, that's going to be very specific. That will be a very specific interval targeting the demand of a specific event. Okay. Do you want to do that all the time? Is that really a training program? No, that is taking an event, building a program that's specific to that. And so if I'm an athlete and I haven't done the prerequisite work, if I do this workout, I'll crumble. So what that means is you have to do this in a periodized plan. So you have to, have that base period. You have to have those build. You have to have been doing enough tempo, building fatigue resistance, working on your threshold levels, working in different areas, and then you start to add maybe some race-specific events that mimic the demand of the event. You don't always want to mimic the demand of the event, but I want to show you how, by using a race file, we can build a specific training program or a specific workout. Okay, so there's the workout that you can do, and then you go back and race, and you go, okay, it felt better this time, it was worse. And that's where you start to kind of put in some notes. So let's look at another race that this athlete did, and this race happened about 7 days prior to the last race, so 14 days. It is a similar race in duration, about 50 minutes. The other one was about 45 minutes, and the break went around the same time. So that's interesting. Within 25 minutes. 25 minutes, that break went. So I did before the break, and you can see this one was a little bit more aggressive in nature. So you can see the variability index was a lot higher, is 1.29. If we look at our other, it was 1.10. So there was a lot more variability in the power spikes in this event. Also here, the athlete averaged. Get back to the correct one, sorry about that. Average 322 watts at normalized power, 250. Look at that spread between the average and the normalized, and then look at that intensity factor for that 20-minute effort. If we go back to the race this weekend, again, the intensity factor a little bit lower. The spread is 290 to 315, not as big a spread between average and normalized power. So a little smoother efforts here. This race was a little bit more violent in the beginning, in the first 20 minutes. You also see a little bit more coasting time. So a little bit of time where they are sitting in the draft. This one does have a hill in it, so that coasting time could be the back half of that hill in there. So you can see this race started off a little bit more violent. You'll see the 1 minute MMP, this kind of stands out. It's 506 watts for 1 minute. If we go back to our other race, the 1 minute was 402. So significantly less on that 1 minute effort, and again, so that's something to kind of look at when you're looking at these different races and simulating the demands. Again, if you look at the 8 minute and the 10 minute, this is smoother. So that 1 minute more than likely happened on one of these hard climbs, and so they produced a big power spike there for 1 minute. And then at the 23 or 4 minute mark, a break goes. And he breaks away with two other riders in this event. All right, so let's look at the eye levels. So if we look at the eye levels again, here 22% of the time or 32% of the time over threshold. If we go back to before, it was 39%, so very similar, only a little difference there. 100 kilojoules, 66 kilojoules of work. If we go back and look at our other one is 115 and 80. So again, criterium, short intensive racing, very similar demands. So if you're going to build workouts, you want to probably start to mimic these numbers. And then he gets in the break. So when he makes the move, he gets in the break. There's a couple guys in this move with him, so he probably gets a little more rest in this break. That's where you see some coasting. There is a hill in this one. And the variability index drops down. You see the intensity factor. And again, we're here almost in time trial mode. The normalized power and the average power are pretty close. You're going to start to see 8 minute and 10 minute MMP start to smooth out within the break. and his cadence on 90 RPM. So I like to kind of look at that cadence number. So here he's in time trial mode. So attacks, boom, 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 and then all of a sudden, look, late race attacks, mid-race attacks, and then the break goes away. So again, if you don't have enough matches, if you don't have a big anaerobic capacity, you have to kind of be selective with those matches, and around that 20-minute mark seems to be the key. All right, so let's look at what he does as far as cadence-wise when he was before the break. So before the break, again, we're going to see 32 and 26 low force. So a lot of low force, using his pedaling wisely. He's not mashing the gear. And then when he gets into the break, we see him spin a little bit more versus the other race, which is a flatter course. So here he does have some low cadence high force, so 30%. But he does a good job here at doing high cadence low force. So he has a couple guys in the break with him. He's able to kind of be smart by spinning his legs and not applying a lot of force and saving his legs. And then here you can see about 21% of the time high cadence, high force. So very good job managing the cadence in that. Here the break, if you can see in the break there is a little bit more red, a few spikes in here. He has a couple guys in the breaks, so they might be putting in some efforts to try to shake it off to two riders, but he stays in there, uses his power wisely. Here you can see 49% of the time over threshold. Again, if we go back to the other break, again, there's 80% of that time was at threshold or just over. So you have to, making the break or making the move is one thing, but then be able to sustain it and have a good threshold to stay within the break is another. And this guy did a great job at that. And then the winning move. So it came down to three riders, and at the end, he just didn't have enough to get around the other guy, just didn't have enough, and he put in a big move, 844 watts, which was a peak power for him for 24 seconds. And the thing that I would maybe critique him on or give him advice on is his cadence was 100 RPMs. Now, I believe this is up a hill, so maybe he started out in a little bit heavy gear, but to get those watts a little bit higher, you got to work on a little bit higher cadence. So get that cadence up to 105, 106, 110, and maybe he can squeak out some more watts. Or if he's going to hit that same cadence, get a little strength to push a few more watts out. Or he may want to adjust his tactic. Maybe he waits a little bit. 24 seconds is a long time, so maybe he holds the wheel and then he comes out at 10 seconds or 15 seconds. So 24 seconds, 800 watts, 850 watts, a pretty big effort. Maxed out at 1,343 watts. So maybe he has to either hold back a little bit, work on cadence maybe a little higher. So this is something we would maybe do in training or look at other races. So again, to mimic the demanded event, same thing. We would, in this race, it's a little more violent. So I probably would do 1 minute FRC, FTP efforts. So maybe I do 1.5 minutes instead of 2 minutes, and I do more of them because it is a little bit more violent of an effort. So if he's, hey, I need to really prepare for this event, it's a lot more volatile. So maybe we do some 1.5 minute efforts and some 30-second efforts for 20-25 minutes. So I have him do some repeated efforts for about 25 minutes, and then I have him do a sustained effort afterwards to mimic that threshold. And that's how we take a race file, we break it down, and we build training specifically for that. So I look at training in two different ways. We are doing training for a physiological effect, so I want to increase someone's threshold, their fatigue resistance, their aerobic capacity, their anaerobic capacity. So I'm attacking it maybe with different types of intervals that will affect building threshold, Pmax or sprint efforts, muscle endurance versus building cardiac output. So doing different things physiologically or prescribing workouts physiologically to move some numbers. And then the other one is race specific. Is building efforts that mimic this type of race scenario, criterium racing, road racing, time trialing, and that way it will improve this athlete's demand the event. So for the athletes who are doing this event, which is our weekend, our monthly event criterium, if you want to make that move, that winning move, you either have to be more selective or work on your training, knowing that in that first 25, 30 minutes, lots of violent efforts. Once you make the move, you have to be able to hold a sustained effort for another 20, 25 minutes. So maybe you start to work on that in your training. The other way to do this is to be more selective. If you know, hey, I don't have enough time to train, or I don't have those genetic gifts of this athlete. But that's the great thing about road racing, is that it's not always about the strongest athlete. It's also about the person who uses the power the wisest, more wise, or smarter, or who is more selective. So you can be a little crafty. You can be, put in some cheeky moves versus going out there and just trying to punch him right in the face. You can kind of sit in, and then near that, maybe minute 20, start to follow some moves and get in the break. And then once you're in the break, if you didn't fire off a bunch of matches, you have more legs. So again, knowing your rider phenotype, the style of rider you are, all of these different things come into road racing. In time trialing, it's a little easier, right? It's the strongest rider who lines up with the most watts, and the most aero, and can perform that day. So I'm not saying there isn't strategy there. There definitely is. But typically, if you're a 300 watt rider and you are super aero, and you go up against a guy who's a 250 watt rider, and they're same aero as you and same mindset, the 300 watt rider is going to always win. In road racing, criterium racing, the 300 watt rider doesn't always win. Sometimes that 250 watt rider will prevail, and they do that because they ride a little smarter, they hold back, and so again, you can use these type of files to build your training programs, to determine how you're going to race an event, and so this is just one way we do it. We'll show you some more of these. This is just from our weekend ride. I want to try to grab, this is from the upper levels, Cat 1 and 2 riders. I want to try to grab maybe a B-level rider and show you how they differ from the Cat 1-2s. That's all I have for you. Sorry, it's a little long-winded, but there's a lot of information that goes into this. I'm just scratching the surface. It takes hours and hours to really dissect these and to gain insight for each individual athlete. That's all I have for you from AeroPro Coaching. Up your watts.
You know what happens when people don't take control? They get deleted. You ready to get deleted, or you ready to take control? Huh? Get in your feet. Let's go.
Pack your bags, girl, let's get out of Dodge. Sick of living life, sick of counting scars. We the ones who go to war against the gods. We the shadows that move around.